Okay, hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of On the Wrist from Off the Cuff. Today we have a very cool comparison for you between one model that you've definitely seen on my channel and another that I haven't even done the full review of yet. We're of course looking at, on the left, the limited edition Seiko Presage SJE073, and on the right, the SARX055. Now, when I first heard about the SJE model, I was really excited, especially by the movement, because the 6L35 definitely was derived from the 4L family, which is such a cool watch movement, and there's just so much, weird little stories that are kind of in mystery around the movement, and I think that's really fun stuff, especially when you really want to geek out, on watch stuff. So we'll definitely talk about more on the movement later on in the video, and definitely really deep dive on the full review. But I did want to make this video because of how different these two watches actually are. I originally thought they were going to be quite similar. And then kind of the more I learned about the watches, the more differences I learned. And I thought that, hey, that I guess at this point, really just the dials are a carryover, but even the dials are not carried over, guys. They are actually different in a lot of ways. And so I just figured I would do a video and really compare and contrast these two very fine models that I think really fulfill a very similar niche in anyone's collection, but at the same time they do have different approaches to them, and they're very special in their own way. Of course, the nature of the coated titanium on the 055 SARX is definitely very special, and nothing, it's not like this is such a devalued watch now that the special limited edition came out of 1,881 units. I would have totally been fine with the SARX, I would say, and never gave a second thought to picking up the SJE, but I was able to get it at a really, really good price and take advantage of the actual Canadian to US dollar exchange rate. So with that said, let's go ahead and take a closer look and get these actually in hand and a little bit up close on the camera. Okay, as you can see, still quite similar in their silhouette. They really have the same lug to lug, pretty much the same as far as the width across as well. But one of the things you notice outright is that crown. Now, the SARX crown is much larger, of course, and then you have this really nice smaller crown here on the SJE. Very standard when you look at that SARX crown versus the crown on the SJE, which definitely has just a little bit more attention to detail there. As you can see, it has that nice kind of matted background on the Seiko S, and it's smaller and it's easier to wind, so it doesn't really need to have that extra size. And then also, along with the profile there, as you can see, it definitely is more proportional to that thinner profile. And the nice thing is that, of course, both watches do have that general Seiko architecture that is so well known for how comfortable it's going to wear, and really wear much better than its specs will tell you. Here you have a watch in the SJE that actually is spec'd quite thin, and then you're adding in those tricks too, so it's just where it's like ultra thin and just feels super comfortable on the wrist, which is really nice. Another thing that stands out at this view is you can see that those links are actually also quite thin in comparison to the much thicker links on the titanium model, and it's all has to do with really the proportions, and I think they really nailed it as far as keeping all the proportions in check. They didn't just slim down one thing or pump up something else. Really, they made sure that everything really was cohesive and came along well. And it would have been really easy to probably do some cost savings and really just take some similar stuff out of existing models. But as you can see, another large difference, of course, is the movement. Now here you have the 6R15D. And then, of course, with the D moniker, it's definitely been refined over time. So this thing is just running really, really well. One of the only drawbacks is that it's a bit thicker, of course, which does add a little bit of heft, which normally doesn't matter when you're wearing a big diver, but for wearing something that's a little bit more dressy, it definitely can be a bit of a compromise. Now, the nice thing is it does have a beautiful 50-hour power reserve versus a 45-hour power reserve here, but the main difference is going to be the beat rate. So you're going to have that 4 hertz tick here versus the traditional 3 hertz tick, which is basically 5 ticks a second. I'm sorry, 8 ticks a second versus 6 ticks a second. And then, if you want to go high beat, that'd be 5 hertz, and it would be 10 ticks a second. So really beautifully done movement here in the 6L35. It definitely has some really cool roots and lineage in that it was originally the base movement that this is, I guess you could say that it was fashioned off of, was the 4L25 movement, which eventually became the 4L75 movement that actually was in a couple of Creedor models, which is pretty cool because Creedor is actually Seiko's premium line that even sits above Grand Seiko. So really nice. Actually, the movement was inspired originally during the time when Seiko, of course, sorry, not Seiko, but ETA was moving away from providing any other options and whatnot, and they were really limiting their sales to other brands. So Seiko decided to do kind of a Swiss style thin movement, and then it ended up being licensed to Soprod. So the Soprod A10 is basically based on the same movement that this movement is based on, which is the 4L25, and there are little slight nuance differences, but really there's something you're going to find under a loop versus what you're going to find just with the naked eye, at least in between the 4L and the A10. This 6L movement is actually quite a little bit different. They did change the shock protection, so it's there's little things that are physically different. Of course, you're not going to find any blued screws or anything like that in the Seiko movement, but that's something that we could probably talk about a lot more in length in the full review. But as far as comparing here, as you can see, the way that the light kind of hits I'd say the brighter luster of the stainless steel is a bit more impressive, a bit deeper, and then you can also notice that the bezel itself is actually different. It has a stepped bezel, and then with the light there, you can actually also notice too that the chapter ring actually is blued. So those indexes and whatnot are going to be blue versus the black, which also ties in to the text on the dial there for Presage and whatnot. Automatic Presage is going to be in the blue text on the SJE versus the black text on the SARX. And then when you look at the actual end link there, you can notice that the end link on the SJE actually goes a bit higher up, so it's a bit more defined, and definitely feels like they took a little bit more effort to really dial that in versus on the SARX, where you're going to see it just a little bit more flush mounted, and it's kind of the opposite for the bracelet. As you can see, the center links on the SARX actually are a bit more pronounced above above the outer links. Here the center links are a little bit more flush. I think they are still a little bit more pronounced above the outer links, but not as high, and definitely not as squared off here. They're definitely be a little more round, a little bit more fluid feeling, and overall just a little bit of a nicer finish. And of course, it's going to be stainless steel versus titanium. The steel, of course, is going to be what everyone's used to working with versus titanium. You got to do a couple of tricks really to have it finish that way. So I would of course expect the stainless steel to have just a nicer luster, and then also the way the brushing is, you can really see the grains through the coating still, versus on the titanium, I'd say the coating almost gives it a bit of a frosted kind of milky effect that kind of washes out some of that very fine grain brushing that is there on the bracelet. Still definitely very comfortable, and very nice to the touch, and really they feel very similar in weight, although one is titanium and one is of course stainless steel. But let's get these on the wrist and see some of the differences. All right, now for the SARX 055, of course, it's a much more of a traditional wear there. The proportions are definitely as to be expected. It looks like a Seiko, feels like a Seiko, although because it's titanium, it does feel a bit lighter. And it's something that you can almost forget is on your wrist if maybe you weren't so obsessed with the way it looked. So it's a really nice piece, and I think it spreads its mass really quite well, because normally would be more of a 39 millimeter kind of guy when it comes to an everyday watch. But here at 40 millimeters, as you can see, this model wears much flatter, and it feels more like a purposeful thin watch. So not only does it have all those Seiko tricks to making it feel thinner and look thinner, it actually is thinner physically. So I'd say the only thing about that is that it does almost make the dial feel a little bit more expansive, because that weight and the visual weight of the watch is a lot flatter now, so it's just not distributed the same way that it is on the SARX. Now, as far as wearing goes, of course, I feel like the flatter and the tighter the wrap, the more comfortable. But visually, I think the SARX has a nicer balance to it. You know, you don't really question the proportions here. I'd say you're very impressed by the thinness, but I think you could almost, with this thinness here, you could probably size this down a millimeter or two and it would still fit really nicely, and it might actually be a little bit more proportional, because how thin it is, you would kind of almost want it to spread that weight out a little bit better. But it really does wrap around the wrist. As you can see, the titanium has a nice drape as well. And, you know, it's, of course, very light. But when it comes to the stainless steel, it definitely, to me anyway, feels just a hair nicer as far as the way that it wraps around the wrist and the comfortableness. And then visually, the weight of the watch, it's nice that it looks like a thin watch and feels like a thin watch, and it's not just something where it's a selling point up front. I think even the casual onlooker can kind of tell that the watch is meant to be a bit thinner than your average watch, and it's even thinner than a lot of quartz watches that are out there. I mean, and some watches can be too thin. So I think the nice thing here is that it's a really happy median, and it's just of course, a gorgeous design. It was gorgeous when it was executed on the SARX, and I think on the SJE, it definitely takes it and refines it a bit more. As you can see, you're going to have the polished edges there on the bracelet links versus the brushed edges on the SARX. And just the way this thing drapes and wraps around the wrist so flat, it's just very, very comfortable. And then you have that nice little crown there, and of course it can be smaller because you don't need to get a bunch of torque on it, because the movement itself is actually quite a bit more refined, and the winding action is also just like you'd expect, especially considering that it was made to be a real Swiss competitor. It definitely gives you a little bit of an extra feel there. So although on wrist they feel quite similar in weight, let's go ahead and get a little scale going and see what the actual difference is. So of course both these watches are fitted for my 7 1/4 inch wrist, so the data here should be quite usable, right at 3.5 ounces. Really nice weight, especially for an automatic timepiece, and especially for one, of course, of that size. Now, for the SJE, it is similar in dimension, except it's just thinner everywhere around, and it's made out of steel. And wow, as you can see, it's actually quite a bit lighter. I'm sorry, heavier. So the SARX is actually quite a bit lighter than it. So that's interesting. It's about pretty close to an ounce heavier there, the steel model, which is surprising. I really thought they were going to be a little bit closer in weight range, But you know, I think it might just be the way that the steel, because it's thinner and wraps a little bit tighter and nicer, it just distributes the weight probably a little bit better and feels less hefty, which ends up, you know, tricking your mind into thinking that it actually is lighter. But I you know, it might just wear that much better, honestly, in this kind of thinner silhouette and profile. So let's go ahead and move on to some low light transition shots so we can just get an idea of what these look like without the really bright studio lights on them, because my bright studio lights do a great job of simulating direct sunlight, as you know. But when it comes to you know, when you're going to spend your time on your watch, you're going to be going in and out of buildings, you know, inside, in and out of your car and whatnot. So it's not always going to be imitating direct sunlight. You're not going to be in the middle of a park when you're wearing your watch all the time. So what I like to do with these low light transitions are, of course, you know, normally it works a little bit better when you have a watch with lume. These do not have lume. But what they do have is some very fine finishing, which does get washed out a bit by the studio lights. So when I do these low light transitions, definitely keep an eye on the way that the light plays off of the links there and the bezel and the case finishings. You can see there now that it, and then also even in the dial, you can see the depth in the dial on the SJE just feels like it has a little bit more of a contrast to it, a little bit of a warmer feel tone wise versus the more cooler, almost blue kind of frosted tint that is on the SARX. Now, and then when you look at the actual bracelet links there, you can see that the it almost has a satinized look as far as the finishing, because the brushing doesn't shine through the same way that it does on the stainless steel, where you can see the little bit more of the granular you know, pattern there versus just a little bit, it almost appears like it's a finer brush, but almost to the extent of where it's almost just kind of a matted look, a satinized look versus a brushed look. I think both look absolutely outstanding, but of course, right now I'm still in the honeymoon with the SJE, so I'm definitely gonna have to give it the high points from the low light transition standpoint. And I mean, these are just really great pieces in general. You know, I definitely would recommend either or. Do I really recommend them both? I mean, if you can find them and you can swing it, I have them both and I really enjoy them. But I could probably live with just the SJE. I think it's just a gorgeous piece. I'm really having trouble thinking of a reason why I would really ever need to wear the SARX again at this point, besides it's just a nice comparison and a good baseline, and it's a watch that I really like. So maybe have it as kind of a backup or something. But we hit the lights back on there. Now we can see back in that kind of full illuminated glory there from the studio lights. It does give you a bit more of a clear shot. Now, I will be doing, like I said, a full review of the SJE, but I did want to make this comparison because there are so many little nuanced differences in these two watches. I really enjoy them both. You know, as far as if you're on the fence about buying one or both or none, and maybe you're just kind of interested in the idea that Seiko made two very similar watches in the same range, or maybe you're just into the baby Grand Seiko aesthetic, and kind of that bargain Grand Seiko, I feel like the SJE is kind of like the tutor to the Grand Seiko Rolex, if you will. That'd probably be the best comparison. And in the same way that Tudor moved away from kind of the lower end movement of an ETA, and kind of did move to the in-house, you could almost say the same for the Seiko, because the Presage had of course the 6-arm movement, which was a bit more generic and more of a workhorse and found in many other models, and then you put this very exclusive movement. Of course, it's like the next level of in-house, because it's only found inside this particular particular watch. So with that said, if you like the video, please do hit like. Definitely let me know what you guys think in the comments. And if you haven't already, please subscribe for more content just like this. Thanks, guys.